You've seen this your entire life, on fridges, on desks, on the edge of computer screens. It's so ordinary that you've stopped seeing it, and that's exactly what makes this story so strange. Because this little yellow square almost didn't exist. Not because the idea was bad, not because the timing was wrong, but because the man who invented it spent 12 years being told it was useless, and the company that eventually made billions from it, they tried to kill it twice. It's 1968, a research laboratory inside of one of America's most respected companies, 3M, a manufacturing company producing industrial materials such as sandpaper and adhesives. There is a chemist named Spencer Silver, and he is working on something important. 3M had tasked their scientists with developing a new, incredibly strong adhesive, the kind that could hold aircraft parts together. Silver worked on it for months, testing compound after compound, and then one day he found something. It stuck, but not very well. It was an adhesive that bonded to surfaces but could be peeled off cleanly. No residue, no damage, just gone. By every measure 3M had given him, this was a failure. They wanted permanent. He'd made temporary. They wanted industrial strength. He'd made something a child could peel off with one finger. Silver filed the patent anyway, because something about it felt interesting. He just had no idea what it was for. And for the next 6 years, nobody did. Silver toured the compound around 3M's internal seminars, showed it to colleagues, to managers, to anyone who'd listen, but the reaction was always the same. Nice, but what's it actually for? 6 years of that. 6 years of a solution with no problem. And if the story ended there, you'd never have heard of Spencer Silver. But the story doesn't. Because somewhere else in Minnesota, a man was sitting in a church, deeply frustrated about a bookmark. Art Fry sang in his church choir every week, and every week he had the same problem. He'd mark his hymn book with small slips of paper so he could find the right page quickly during the service, and every week they'd fall out. It sounds made up, but Fry was also a chemical engineer at 3M, and chemical engineers don't just get annoyed by problems, they start thinking about solutions. He remembered Silver's seminars, the adhesive that stuck, but not permanently, that left no mark. He thought, what if I could stick a bookmark to a page, and then move it whenever I want? It seems obvious now, but in 1974, this idea was completely invisible to everyone except Art Fry, and even Fry didn't fully understand what he'd stumbled onto. He started experimenting in his spare time, coating strips of paper with Silver's adhesive, testing them, adjusting the formula slightly, peeling them off, sticking them back, and it worked. But there was a problem, a significant one, because Fry wasn't just an inventor, he was an employee at one of the biggest companies in America, where there were rules for everything, and what he was holding, nobody at 3M had asked for. Here's something you need to understand about 3M in the 1970s. They were not some small startup. They had tens of thousands of employees, a rigid internal structure, product divisions, approval committees, market research requirements. To get a new product to market, you needed data, consumer surveys, projected revenue, manufacturing feasibility studies, proof that people would actually buy it. And how do you prove people want something that they've never seen before? That was Fry's problem. He had a product, he had a use case, but he had no data, because you can't survey people about a product that doesn't exist yet. So he did something that broke almost every rule in 3M's rulebook. He started giving it away, not selling, not pitching, just handing them out to assistants, to executives, to anyone who'd take a pack. And then he waited. Within weeks, people started coming back, not to say thank you, not to leave a review, but to ask for more. One executive's assistant used them to annotate reports. A manager stuck one to a document he sent to his boss with a handwritten question on it, and his boss responded on the same note and sent it back. That was the moment. That was when Fry realized this wasn't a bookmark. This was a communication tool, a new way for people inside organizations to talk to each other. And once you saw it that way, the market wasn't a few choir singers with hymn books. The market was every office in the world. But 3M's leadership didn't see it that way, not yet, and what happened next almost ended the entire thing before it began. Fry brought his prototype to 3M's product development team. He had testimonials, he had internal users raving about it, he had a story. The response was polite and devastating. The commercial office products division looked at it and passed. Their argument was simple. People already had notepads, people already had paper clips. Why would they pay for a sticky piece of paper? Which, to be fair, was a completely reasonable question in 1975. So Fry went back, kept refining, kept distributing internally, and the informal fanbase inside 3M kept growing. And eventually, reluctantly, the company agreed to a market test. It's now 1977. 3M launched what they called Press and Peel in 4 cities: Boise, Denver, Tampa, in Richmond. They put it on shelves and waited. But the test failed. Sales were almost non-existent, and 3M's leadership took that as confirmation of what they'd suspected all along. Nobody wanted this. The product was quietly shelved. Fry was told that this probably wasn't worth pursuing anymore, and that should have been the end. For most people, it would have been. But Fry had noticed something in the test data that nobody else seemed to care about. In the cities where the product had been given away as free samples first, sales had been dramatically higher. People who tried it bought it, but people who just saw it on a shelf walked past it, which meant the product wasn't the problem, the launch strategy was, and Fry had one more idea. Fry convinced 3M to try one more test, this time just in Richmond, but with a completely different approach. Instead of putting the product on shelves, they blanketed the city. Every office, every business, every secretary, every manager, free samples everywhere. Not a handful of samples, enormous quantities, the kind of saturation that felt almost reckless. 3M called it the Boise Blitz, named after one of the failed test cities as a kind of dark joke, a last attempt before the whole thing was abandoned. And then something happened that 3M's market research had completely failed to predict. Reorder rates hit 90%. 9 out of 10 people who received free samples went out and bought them, unprompted, without advertising. The product didn't need explaining. It didn't need a marketing campaign. It just needed to be experienced. And that finding, that specific insight, changed how 3M thought about the product entirely, because suddenly they weren't looking at a novelty item with a small niche market. They were looking at something with a 90% conversion rate. In consumer goods, that number is almost unheard of. 3M launched nationally in 1980 under a new name, Post-it notes. Within a year, they were one of the top 5 best-selling office products in America. But here's the thing about massive commercial success. It doesn't just bring money, it brings attention, and attention brings competitors, and competition brought a problem that nearly destroyed Post-it notes. Not in the market, inside 3M itself. By the mid-1980s, Post-it notes were everywhere, but so were knockoffs. Dozens of companies started producing near identical products, same size, same colour, and a similar adhesive, sold at a lower price. 3M had a patent on silver's adhesive formula, but the concept of a repositional note that was much harder to protect. And 3M faced a choice that every company faces when a competitor enters their space. Do you compete on price, or do you compete on brand? Competing on price meant shrinking margins. It meant a race to the bottom. It meant eventually becoming a commodity. So 3M chose brand, and what they did next is quietly one of the most effective brand strategies in corporate history. They made the yellow non-negotiable, not because the yellow was scientifically optimal, not because consumers had asked for it, but because of an accident. The original Post-it notes were yellow because the lab next door to Fry's workspace only had yellow scrap paper available when he was running his early tests. That's it. That's the reason. $1 billion brand identity born from whatever paper was lying around. But 3M leaned into it completely. Yellow became the signal. If it wasn't yellow, it wasn't a Post-it note. Meanwhile, the competition sold every colour: pink, blue, green, white, which made 3M's yellow more distinctive, more ownable, and more recognisable. The copycats had given 3M something that couldn't have been bought: contrast. By the late 1980s, despite cheaper alternatives flooding the market, Post-it notes held an 80% market share. But the real battle wasn't with competitors. It never had been. The real battle had always been internal, and in the 1990s, it came back harder than before. 3M was under new pressure. The economy had shifted, shareholders were restless, and a new wave of management consultants had arrived at 3M's headquarters with a very clear message: cut what isn't core, focus on what scales, and eliminate complexity. And Post-it notes, despite being one of 3M's best-selling products, had a problem. They were expensive to make. The adhesive manufacturing process was complex. The quality control requirements were strict. Margins were thinner than they looked from the outside. Several senior figures inside 3M began arguing that the company should let other manufacturers make them and take a royalty, remove the manufacturing headache entirely. On paper, it made sense. Predictable income, lower costs, no operational risk. But there was something the spreadsheets didn't capture. Post-it notes weren't just a product. They were the reason people thought differently about 3M. They were proof that 3M could turn an accident into an empire. They were the story the company told about itself. License it out, and you hand that story to someone else. The internal debate lasted years. It was never fully public, but people inside 3M who were there during that period have spoken about it since. The tension between the finance side and the brand side. And eventually, 3M kept it. But the argument had revealed something uncomfortable. Even the company's biggest success story wasn't safe from the company itself. In the late 1990s, a new threat appeared. Not a competitor, not a shareholder, but something more fundamental: the paperless office. For years, technology writers had been predicting it. Email would replace memos, digital calendars would replace paper calendars, screens would replace sticky notes. And for a moment, it genuinely looked like they might be right. Sales softened, 3M's internal teams started running scenarios. What does a world without paper look like? And what does Post-it look like in that world? The answer, which 3M arrived at slowly and then committed to completely, was counterintuitive. They didn't try to go digital, they went more physical. New sizes, new formats, new colours beyond yellow, but always with the yellow as the anchor. Post-it super sticky, Post-it extreme notes. The product family expanded precisely as a digital threat loomed. And here's what 3M had understood, that most technology analysts hadn't. Physical notes do something screens can't. They exist in space. You can see 20 of them at once. You can move them, group them, cluster them on a wall. You can stand back and see a pattern. But screens are linear. You scroll up, you scroll down, one thing at a time. The tech industry had assumed that digital was always better. But 3M proved that sometimes analog has an advantage that no software can replicate. The paperless office never came, not fully, and Post-it notes didn't just survive the digital age. They became more embedded in creative and professional culture than ever before. Everywhere people needed to think, that little yellow square appeared. But the biggest chapter of this story hadn't happened yet. Nobody at 3M planned for what happened next. Sometime in the mid-2010s, Post-it notes became aesthetically iconic, not because of a marketing campaign, not because of a celebrity endorsement, but because the visual language of creative work had started to look like a Post-it wall. Google used them, IDEO used them, McKinsey used them. IDEO, one of the world's most respected design firms, put Post-it notes in their methodology guides as essential equipment. 3M hadn't lobbied for this. They hadn't paid for product placement. They hadn't even noticed it happening until it already had. The Post-it note had become a symbol, not just of organization, but of thinking itself, of the creative process, of ideas in motion. And when something becomes a symbol, the economics change completely, because you're no longer selling a product, you're selling what the product means, which is why, when 3M eventually launched Post-it as a standalone digital app, it wasn't competing with the physical product, it was extending the symbol into a new space. Same color, same feel, same cultural weight. A $5 app carrying 50 years of meaning. But there's one more thing. One thing that ties this entire story together. And it goes back to the very beginning. Back to Spencer Silver. Back to the lab. Back to the failure. 3M has a policy. It's been in place for decades, and it's one of the most unusual policies in corporate America. Every 3M researcher is allowed to spend 15% of their working time on projects that have nothing to do with their official assignments. No approval needed, no deliverables required, just go and find something interesting. It sounds generous, maybe even reckless, but this policy is the reason Post-it notes exist entirely. Spencer Silver wasn't working on a repositional adhesive, he was working on a strong one, and he failed. But because 3M gave him the freedom to pursue the failure, he eventually connected with someone who could see what it was worth. The accidental inventor, and the man who found a problem that fit the accident. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because most companies would have buried Silver's compound after the first seminar. Most companies would have cancelled Fry's project after the first failed market test. Most companies would have licensed the formula when the shareholders got restless. And most companies would have pivoted to digital and left physical products behind. 3M did none of those things. Not because they were visionary, not because their leadership was uniquely brilliant, but because they had built a system that made space for failure. And that very system produced scotch tape, sandpaper, reflective road markings, surgical masks, and a little yellow square that generates over $1 billion in annual revenue from a glue that just wasn't strong enough. You've seen this your entire life, and now you know what it cost to make it exist. 12 years of rejection, 2 failed market tests, 1 internal battle that nearly killed it, a digital revolution that was supposed to make it obsolete, and an entire corporation that at multiple points almost chose the sensible option. The thing about Post-it notes is that every part of their creation was an accident. The adhesive was wrong. The colour was whatever paper was lying around. The market wasn't where the company expected. And yet here we are. There's a vision of this story where Spencer Silver's compound gets filed away and forgotten, where Art Fry gives up after the second rejection, where 3M's finance team wins the argument in the boardroom, and where the digital age makes sticky notes feel unneeded. In that vision of the story, the product that didn't work stays a product that didn't work. But in this vision, Someone kept going, against the data, against the committee, against the market research, against every sensible reason to stop. And that's the part they don't put in the business school case study, the part that actually mattered.